Good morning. Today is Tuesday, December 17th, 2024. When I was a child, I had two uncles who lived in Boston. I was raised in Memphis. Uncle Elias and Uncle Joe, they were my father's brothers. And these uncles were very, very nice, very, very generous, very, very concerned. Of course, we lived a far way away, but we tried to stay in touch. And one of the things that they did is that they would send us presents. And one of the presents that they used to send us, which I remember very, very well, they would send us the Fruit of the Month Club. Now, I don't know if that still exists, but years ago it was a big thing, Fruit of the Month Club. So every month you'd get a box, and it would have a selection of fruits that were just the most perfectly picked, ripe, beautiful fruits. And I remember we enjoyed them so much. Especially, my favorite was the apples. The apples that would come were different varieties of apples. They were so fragrant. They were so delicious. Now, sadly, I don't remember any of the names of the varieties of those apples. I was just a kid. But since then, I have rarely had an apple that tastes as good as I remember from my uncles. A few years later, I was a bit older, and Granny Smith apples came onto the scene, and they were very good. They were different. They were tart. And just by the way, this is in the parentheses, that if you're going to bake something with apples, it's best to have a mixture of different kinds of apples. So I'm going to tell you the best recipe for applesauce. People make applesauce to get ready for Hanukkah. Here it goes. You want a combination of Granny Smith apples and Macintosh apples. Skin them, cut them up. Add a little bit of white sugar, a little bit of lemon juice so they're not too sweet, and here's the kicker, a few cranberries. And I am telling you, that is the best applesauce you will ever have. But it relies on a combination of apples, some hard, some soft, to give you some texture. That's the best applesauce. As I got older, apples seemed to lose their fragrance. For the last number of years, if one would go into a grocery store or a farmer's market and smell the apples, usually there's nothing there. Some of them may be okay. But rarely do I find over the last, 20, 30 years, an apple that I consider to be excellent. Until the Honeycrisp apple. Now, the story of the Honeycrisp apple is a fascinating story. It was developed in 1983. It came into retail availability in 1991. And it became a sensation of the apple world. Genevieve Yam, who is an expert on cooking and apples, she writes, talking about the first time she had a Honeycrisp apple. The apple's paper-thin skin produced an audible crunch, and a burst of sweet, tart juice immediately filled my mouth. I chewed carefully. I couldn't recall the last time I ate an apple for pleasure, on its own. Not in my hand as a grab-and-go breakfast as I rushed out of the house. Not sliced up and slathered with nut butter. Not peeled, cored, chopped, and baked into a pie. The Honeycrisp apple was revelatory to me. It was an apple that I truly enjoyed eating on its own. And that success was very widespread. The Honeycrisp apple, which originated in Minnesota, became one of the most popular apple varieties today. Because before that, for much of the 1960s and the 1970s, there was really no interest in different kinds of apples other than red delicious apples, which were specifically developed to have a nice, big, shiny red apple that was available year-round. And so it was durable, it was aesthetically pleasing, it could be transported or stored. Okay, so it didn't taste like much. But that was like the state of apples. And then the Honeycrisp apple came onto the scene. The Honeycrisp apple redefined what an apple could be. It was different from any other apple most American shoppers had encountered before, especially for consumers who frequented conventional grocery stores rather than farmers markets, where tastier heirloom varieties could be found. But unlike many other apple varieties, the Honeycrisp apple wasn't bred to grow, to store, or ship well. Instead, it was bred for taste, crisp, with balanced sweetness and acidity. Today, over 50% of new apples coming onto the market today are Honeycrisp. But a few years ago, something happened. You may have noticed this. I noticed this in the last several years. In the last several years, I noticed that the Honeycrisp apples that I bought were increasingly mediocre. There are a few good ones here and there, but often the Honeycrisp apples that are available today are dry and mealy, and there is not much to distinguish them between other mediocre apple varieties. She writes, as recently as September of this year, I had several Honeycrisp apples from a local farm that were terribly mushy and flavorless, making me wonder if they had mistakenly labeled another apple variety. Nothing about those apples was like the fruit I had once loved. And here's what happened. The Honeycrisp apple became a victim of its own success, because it was developed in Minnesota. It was developed as a seasonal fruit. And in order to satisfy the demand, they tried to plant it all year round so that it would be available all year round. Plus, the largest apple market in the United States is in Washington State, the state of Washington on the West Coast. And so any apple that is going to succeed commercially needs to be in Washington. The problem is that Honeycrisp apples were not suited for the conditions in Washington. And growers in Washington never intended to sell their supply just during a short growing season when the apples were at their best. They wanted to supply the apples year-round and in large enough quantities to stock supermarket shelves across the country in order to make some serious money. The move to Washington facilitated the arrival of Honeycrisp everywhere and made it possible for consumers to purchase the apple variety wherever and whenever they wanted. And then the problems became obvious. One professor who studies this at Cornell University, his name is Ian Merwin, said there's no question that the quality that's in the market is not what it was 10 years ago. Apples, even Honeycrisp, are spending longer than ever in storage. And even with advances in refrigeration and technology, that further erodes their quality. Honeycrisp today does not live up to people's expectations. And for the first time ever, there is an oversupply of Honeycrisp apples, which means that the price is dropping, and the price for Honeycrisp apples is lower than it ever has been. It's also less satisfying and delicious than it ever has been. The Honeycrisp is a victim of its own success and has become exactly what the scientists despised about the variety's predecessors. The Honeycrisp has become a boring commodity apple. It's true about apples, and it's true in many areas of life. No one can excel in everything. And so often a person will do well in one area and then think, well, I could just expand. If I could do this, I certainly could do that. And it turns out that everything becomes mediocre. So here's an important lesson in life. Choose what you're good at. Choose what gives you pleasure and gratification, and stick with it. And you can change from time to time. But don't try to be all things to all people, because you don't want to turn out like the Honeycrisp apple of today. And if you do find a new, wonderful, fragrant apple variety that is available, please let me know. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.